State Parliament sat this week, and usually at this time we report on the proceedings. But we can't show you any vision from the chamber because the network television cameras have been banned for 9 sitting days. That's because the networks, including the ABC, breached the conditions of broadcast last month by showing vision of a rowdy protest in the public gallery. Television news cameras weren't always allowed to record parliamentary proceedings. Until the 90s, TV news reports had to make do with vision from outside the chamber. That changed under Speaker Jim Forrest during the Goss Labor government. But there have always been conditions on the broadcast. In the event of unparliamentary behaviour or disturbance by strangers in the public gallery, the camera is not to show the offending incident. Last month, the 4 Brisbane networks, the ABC included, breached that by showing a rowdy protest in the gallery on the night of a debate about civil unions.
Those in the gallery, if they could leave.
The Speaker, Fiona Simpson, said the breach showed disregard for standing orders and could contribute to future public safety issues. She banned the TV cameras for 9 sitting days. 7:30 Queensland invited Miss Simpson onto the program, but there was no response. The Speaker was at the LNP State Convention. That's where I spoke with Professor of Public Policy at the Australian Catholic University, Scott Prasser. Well, Professor, of course, reporters are concerned about the cameras being banned for 9 sitting days, but does anyone else care?
Well, people should care. Democracy is not just about casting a ballot, it's about seeing how government operates and what is going on in Parliament. And one of the problems that we've seen is we didn't know enough what was going on in Parliament in the previous government. So we should care. If we don't care, we should change our views.
How important to the overall coverage of politics is the coverage of Parliament, do you think? And you can be frank, I don't mind.
Look, it's very important. Parliament is where the legislation is passed, the things that affect our lives, the taxes, the budgets, the regulations, and we ought to have more discussion and more open debate about what goes on in Parliament and have a clear idea what we're getting for our money. Parliament costs $50–60 million a year to run, so we want to know what it's doing in those days it does meet.
The Parliament, of course, does provide its own in-house vision. We are allowed to use that. But we are the last, or one of the last parliaments in Australia to allow independent cameras.
Well, I think it's important to have independent cameras so that you get the shots that sometimes the government doesn't want to see. You can look at sometimes who's sitting in Parliament, who's not there, and you can look at people's attitudes, the way people speak. So I think it's pretty important that we have independent media operators giving us a view of what's going on.
The Premier was the keynote speaker during the morning session of the LNP convention. He used his speech to outline his government's plan for the next 6 months. He followed that with a news conference, his first since Sunday. Unlike some former premiers, Campbell Newman doesn't make a daily habit of speaking to the media. The penalty for breaching the broadcast conditions was imposed by the Speaker, not by the government. But I want to broaden the discussion now and ask you, in terms of the government's media strategy in the first 3 months, what have you noticed?
Well, this government has won such a big majority. Nearly 50, got 50% of the vote, and it's got about 90% of the seats. They've given them immense power, and I think their view of the world is we want to bypass the media. We want to try and talk directly to people of Queensland. Hence, Campbell Newman's presidential-style media address we had a couple of weeks ago, hence the limited press conferences that we're getting. The government wants to not just monitor the media, they want to sometimes bypass the media because they're very suspicious of the media, what's happened in the past.
Of course, we don't have a divine right to expect premiers to be available at the drop of a hat. Do you think our opinion's been affected by the media strategy of former premiers?
We might be. We know Premier Beattie described himself as a media tart, but one of the trends we have had in governments these days is the leaders, the premiers have dominated the whole show, what's going on. Now, I think what you're seeing with Newman, he's being a bit more discreet about how often he goes on the media. He's trying to make himself a particular type of product in terms of not being over-accessible, because when the hard times comes, he's going to have to say, I'm not accessible. But it's very interesting the strategy he's adopting, and this is very early days for this government, and it's a new government with a lot of inexperience in dealing with a broad range of issues. So it's one to watch.
Do you think this government needs media?
Look, at the end of the day, all governments need media. This is how people interpret what goes on. This is how they get their news, those front page headlines, those radio news broadcasts. Of course they need the media. Now, despite all the growth of social media and so on. We know from the evidence that this general basic media still affects people's political views.
Scott Prasser says previous governments have tried to control their message by controlling the media. He says the LNP has a different tactic of not using news organisations as much and finding other ways to communicate with the public. In other words, he says, the LNP is using a new strategy.
I think the government is looking at previous governments who tended to use the media as like a theatre to display their wares, and it was too orchestrated and too organised. And this government's trying to do something different.